So we're picking back up where we left off with this drawing, and I wanted the light source to come from below and in front of my figure. So I originally thought of the book as glowing, and you'll see that I ended up not going that route, but still the light source comes from that general area. So everything in the picture responds to that in terms of light logic. You'll see that I shade the face to be lit from beneath, and the hands and arms in particular. And I really had a bit of a challenge trying to figure out which values went with which type of highlight. Some places we have pure white. Most of the highlights are going to be that light purple, and we have a kind of darker purple. So what I wanted to point out here before I started shading was that there are ways that I think about shading folds. I didn't really notice this until I started making this demonstration, but in places where things make a kind of Y shape, where they intersect, you can look at the inside of that Y as where the shadow is going to fall. Also like hooked shapes too sometimes, because it can be kind of maybe an implied Y. It doesn't have to be exactly a Y. What happens in these areas is that things overlap. The fabric folds in on itself, and so parts of it come forward and parts of it recess towards the body or whatever the fabric is sitting on. And so that really helps to think about where the shadows are going to go. Since fabric kind of undulates, you have areas where there are shadows, and then you have areas that are highlighted or mid-toned that generally sit next to the shadow. So the red places that I've outlined aren't always going to be the crease. Sometimes they are the edge of the highlighted part as opposed to the shadow part. It's a very intuitive process, kind of, but if you just think of shading the recessed bits and then putting the highlights directly beside that or next to them with some mid-tone transition in between, that's really going to help you figure out how to create a believable set of folds on clothing. So I set to work doing that. I did a little bit of intuitive stuff. I kind of fudged it in some places, and mostly I relied on the scratchy sort of pencil-y texture to give a nice smooth change from shadow to highlight so that it wasn't all blocky, and I kind of like that. It gives it a ghostly, ephemeral kind of look. I do wish that the pencil brush was a little more nuanced in its mark making so that it didn't look quite as patchy as it turned out. I probably could have fiddled with it a lot more than I did, but I didn't. Story of my life. Using that textural transition really helped me be able to create a nice rendering with only two values or colors. You have that background purple and the black of the shirt, and that's a good trick to use even if you're only using, black and white. If you put down just a bit of the color, then it can act as a mid-tone of its own. So that's something maybe that you pick up working with charcoal or something of that nature, and that's kind of the idea that I had. Hair as well, this one's kind of, I think the light logic is definitely pushed and exaggerated, because some of these hairs would have to actually be lit from above, but I think that it kind of works, in my opinion, to add body and volume to the hair. Sometimes you can get away with doing things that are unrealistic and unnatural if you can do it convincingly enough. So again, here's a diagram to show my thought process with the shading of the cape. Something that I wanted to point out is that in the area directly under the jawline around the neck, that is recessed, and so in order to achieve that effect, I wanted to shade it pretty much entirely on the inside solid black. Even though it does have some theoretical movement in there, I think that adding that kind of depth helps to show the area as recessed. And because the cape sits on top of the shirt, I decided to give it a little bit of the lighting from below, the same hue that's on the forearms and the skin, just because it comes forward more in space, and it helps to give the illusion that it does that in the drawing as well. I decided that I wanted to add some stuff to the background, and so I tried to add a sort of wall, perhaps a horizon line, and I thought about shading the ground, but instead I wanted to create a shadow because that seemed like the logical progression for the way that the light was behaving. So I blacked out the whole silhouette roughly, and I made it a sort of gray. I put some kind of filter on it, I don't remember. So I skewed it a little bit and tilted it and gave it a soft glow effect to make it a little bit fuzzy. And I do think that this helped. It does kind of take it out of the realm of 4 values that I was working with, and it took it up to 5 technically, even though you could consider it the same value as the black because I was using the black on a separate layer. But finally, I think that because I didn't have the book glowing like I wanted to, I needed to establish a light source, and so I decided to have this sort of magical circle that glowed underneath everything. And it's kind of cool, actually. I really like the way that it turned out. Drawing-wise, it definitely looks mystical, but also kind of sci-fi futuristic. The papers were interesting to color. I think that that's where I had the most problem trying to make them convincing. I think that their rendering gives them their illusion of depth a lot more than the actual colors that I applied. And I think that that's not really smart in terms of art, because I should be utilizing the colors to the fullest to be able to push that convincingness of the perspective and rendering even further than it was. So that's something that I think I could work a little bit harder on, is how to make the silhouette of the paper behave appropriately in this environment. While this picture is very dynamic, I think that I definitely see some spots that I can improve on my next drawing. I think that I set out to challenge myself with using a limited number of values, and I did that decently well, but the purpose of my doing that is because I knew that I'm not as successful at it as I am when I have free reign over every color that I want to use. So I do think that I could practice more with this style and really figure out how to use value in a way to push the final image even further than I took it here. Well, that is it for this 2-part series. I hope you enjoy the final product. I'm thinking that next week I might tackle my my channel art, because I realized the other day that it's looking a little rough. I kind of forgot that I was gonna spice it up, and I never did that. So maybe that's what I'll do next. I'm not sure yet, but that definitely is on the to-do list. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.